For this lecture number 2, I thought I would take you into my own secret garden. So the images which you see here come from my stomping grounds, my garden. So I indicated in the first lecture that I was going to point out the similarities between the garden and the manor house. So that's the first thing to be done here. The garden, as I was hoping you would see in your diagrams, the garden is a series of walled gardens connected door to door to door. And that's exactly what the book comments on. Now there is a reference to a fountain, a kind of a formal entryway to the garden area. She'd passed through the shrubbery gate. She found herself in great gardens with wide lawns and winding walks with clipped borders, and a pool with an old great fountain in its midst. Yes, there is that. But we keep going, and it says, she saw that at the end of the path she was following there seemed to be a long wall with ivy growing over it. She was not familiar enough with England to know that she was coming upon the kitchen gardens where the vegetables and fruit were growing. She went towards the wall and found that there was a green door in the ivy, and it stood open. This was not the closed garden, evidently, and she could go into it. She went through the door and found that it was a garden with walls all around it, and that it was only one of several walled gardens which seemed to open into one another. And then when you think about Misselthwaite Manor, what impression comes to mind? The impression that comes to mind most clearly would be the impression of corridors and rooms. And it says in chapter 6, when she's wandering about in one of those days that she can't go out, she opened the door, went into the corridor, she began her wanderings. It was a long corridor, and it branched into other corridors, and it led her up short flights of steps which mounted to others again. There were doors, and there were pictures on the walls. Doors and doors. So corridor, doors. Now think back at the garden, walled gardens, a door which gives access from one walled garden to the other walled garden. The same thing's going on here. And there are all sorts of parallels. Now, we know one parallel, obviously, is that as Mary finds the key and as she finds the door to the secret garden and finds the treasure therein, there's also that moment in which she finds the door hidden behind a tapestry to Colin's room and finds, so to speak, a treasure there. Now, when she finds the secret garden, everything there is still dormant. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be brought to life. Colin, when he is found, is also essentially dormant. He needs to be nurtured. He needs to be brought to life. Now, with the parallel between the garden and the manor house, we're looking at a parallel of walled places, a parallel of isolated persons. Now, the secret garden is not necessarily an isolated person, but it is at the heart of Archibald Craven's self-isolation. The fact that he has withdrawn from humanity, essentially, for the past 10 years. And then in the manor, we have a walled place in which we find Colin. So the walls are and we commented on this in the first lecture, the walls clearly are images of isolation, starting with India and starting with the room, the dark room in which we find the lonely, isolated, forgotten Mary, and then going to Misselthwaite Manor, where we find the lonely, isolated Colin, and we find Ben Weatherstaff in a walled garden, he too isolated from much of humanity. And we're wondering if these walls, the walls both of the manor and the walls of the garden, if they are images of isolation, then in the process of her redemption, why does Mary not escape Misselthwaite Manor? Why does she not escape perhaps to the moor? Now the moor clearly is the area of openness. It is anti-wall. It is the area of Dickon, the free boy who moves in accord with nature and seems to move without any restrictions whatsoever. So if Mary is in isolation, and if we are looking at the course of her redemption in the novel, then again, why does it not include her liberation from Misselthwaite Manor, which is obviously the walled place or the walled garden? The the book is a bit more profound than all of this. And when we think about the profundity of the book, the first thing we realize is that the book is not simply a book which was written to raise your environmental consciousness. The point of the book is not be kind to Tweety birds. If that were the point of the book, then finding these human hearts within Misselthwaite Manor would not be an issue at all. We we find Mary, we find Alan, we find Ben Weatherstaff, we find Mary's uncle. Those are the real gardens, the real secrets. So the book is not interested in environmental affirmation, but it's there. Obviously, closeness to the earth is an important factor, but it's an important factor which leads us to a different kind of depth. So the depth in the earth, the richness of the garden, these are simply images of human depth, human richness. The, the book itself tells us directly that its interest is in human relationship. And one of the ways in which the book tells us that is in the conversation between Ben Weatherstaff and Mary. And the topic of that conversation is quite simply the topic of friendship. It takes place in chapter 4. Ben Weatherstaff comments about the robin that he's the only friend I've got. Mary answers, I have no friends at all. I never had. My ayah didn't like me, and I never played with anyone. It is a Yorkshire habit to say what you think with blunt frankness, and old Ben Weatherstaff was a Yorkshire moor man. "Tha and me are a good bit alike," he said. "We was wove out of the same cloth. We're neither of us good-looking, and we're both of us as sour as we look. We got the same nasty tempers, both of us, I'll warrant." This was plain speaking, and Mary Lennox had never heard the truth about herself in her life. This was plain speaking, and Mary Lennox had never heard the truth about herself in her life. Now here's the point that you have to get in understanding The Secret Garden. Now I've asked the question, why, if she finds redemption, now by redemption I mean she finds life, she finds friendship, she finds purpose. If she finds all these things, and if she finds a sort of freedom in finding friendships and life and purpose, again, why doesn't it take her out of the moor? Because the wisdom of the book is in affirming that the key, the key to the self is not in running out beyond the walls, but is in digging in, not jumping over the boundaries of self, but digging in to the boundaries of self, the discovery of self. And that's that key there. Mary Lennox had never heard the truth about herself in her life. Mary Lennox does not know who Mary Lennox is. She begins to understand that in the course of the book. So again, this is the point that I want you to get. Finding life, finding self, is a movement that goes farther in, deeper in, farther in. And that's why we never really leave the walls of Misselthwaite Manor, but the secrets to each of these characters, to each of these isolated, lonely characters like Mary and Colin and Ben and Archibald, the secret is right there in the manor, in the gardens.